Hi, I am Dr. Samir bin Osman, and in this video we're going to talk about the principles of biology. So biology is the study of the structure of living organisms, the function and interactions between and within living organisms. So all biological systems are built on carbon-based molecules that are dissolved in water and interact with oxygen for the most part to perform their biochemical reactions that are essential for their life. So let's talk about these components a little bit and why these components are important for life. Carbon is a relatively small atom with a half-filled valence orbital, and we talked about these in chemistry. If you need to kind of learn more about this, I would send you to the chemistry video. So it has a half-filled valence orbital that is neither very keen to lose electrons or keen to gain electrons. And so it prefers to form strong covalent bonds with up to 4 other atoms with widely varied properties, forming either polar, i.e. hydrosoluble molecules, or non-polar, i.e. hydrophobic molecules, making it so versatile for making complex reactions that all discovered life is actually carbon-based. Now, oxygen is an atom that seeks to gain 2 electrons, and so it prefers to form 2 ionic bonds that are weaker than the covalent bonds, which means that are easier to break than covalent bonds, and so it's easier for them to release energy, and that's what makes it the main energy transmitter in most of the biological organisms. Now, water has some unique capabilities because of its polarity and because of the hydrogen bonds that bind it to each other. We spoke about them also in chemistry. And just to kind of give a very quick refresher, so it has the ability to be cohesive liquid that's going to be able to absorb and dissolve polar molecules, and most of the molecules in biology are polar actually. It also regulates the heat. It has a high heat retention, and it also dissolves most of the molecules, making it the second essential element in biology and the universal solvent in biology. So these components, what other components do they make that are also essential for biology? So carbon's gonna form molecules that mostly include hydrogen, oxygen, and then to a lesser degree nitrogen, and then to a lesser degree phosphorus. And the specific arrangement of these molecules is going to give them very different properties that fall in 3 broad categories. So the first is the sugars, or the carbohydrates, which are polar molecules made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and that's the name, carbohydrates, that can release energy quickly. The short carbohydrates are sugars like glucose, or they can release energy slowly, such as the case for long carbohydrates like starch. And you can see here, glucose actually is just a component of starch. Starch is just many glucoses linked together. Another long carbohydrate is cellulose, that basically is found in the leaves of fruits, of vegetables, of trees, etc. And the main energy source for main organisms is then carbohydrates. Long carbohydrates also have the rigidity that's important for building the backbone of DNA. So the backbone of DNA is made of those long carbohydrates, and also is a structural component of plant cells like cellulose that we just spoke about. In addition to that, we have the second category, which is lipids. So lipids are non-polar long molecules, so non-dissolvable in water, because they're non-polar, so will be dissolvable in oils. And they're mostly made of carbon and oxygen, and they serve as slow energy sources. So when combined with a polar phosphate, they become surfactants. And remember, surfactants are molecules that can bind water on one side and lipids on the other side. And so it makes them ideal as cell membranes, because the cell membranes will retain the water-based cell contents within the cell and block them from going out, because they don't like the oily part, the lipid part of the membrane. In addition to that, we have the third category, which is proteins. And they're made up of a combination of many amino acids Amino acids have a unique structure actually, whereby, like carbohydrates, they can daisy chain as well. So you can be linked one to another, and that's what makes proteins. But each amino acid has a side chain, and that side chain will have unique properties for each amino acid. There are about 20 amino acids in the human body, and there are a little bit more for other species, but the principle here is that those side chains will have unique properties. Some of them are polar, some of them are non-polar, some of them have kinks, some of them don't, some of them are bulky, some of them don't. And that makes the assembly of these amino acids into proteins give every protein a unique shape. Just think of it as like Lego blocks. You have like 20 different types of Lego blocks. So you have a lot of possible combinations of those. And a protein can be made of as many as little as like 15 amino acids or 20, or it can be made of as many as thousands of amino acids. So you can you can imagine how complex a protein can be and how specific can be. And this is very important because proteins are highly specialized structures. So they can facilitate reactions, they can facilitate activities, they can also be building blocks. So their versatility comes from the versatility of the amino acids and the ability to arrange them in many different ways. So then, now that we have these components, how do they function? What are the biological functions that they accomplish? So there are many ways to kind of classify them. This is kind of a personal attempt at classifying them. You can think of them as functions that are vital, so necessary for life, and functions that facilitate the vital functions. So they're not necessary, but they really accelerate the vital functions. And then you can think of other sources that are important, but they're not performed by the biological entity itself, but they're just outsourced to other entities. And so let's talk about each one of those separately. So with the vital ones, let's start with the growth and multiplication. So in order to power themselves, organisms, they have to harvest energy from the release of electrons by breaking down simple molecules like glucose. Plants and algae, they use photosynthesis, whereby they use sun radiation, the photons from the sun, to combine CO2 in the atmosphere with water, H2O, to make glucose. And then other organisms, they will use chain reactions like the efficient aerobic respiration, which uses oxygen, that's hence the name aerobic, or less efficient anaerobic respiration, i.e. without oxygen, or fermentation, to break down the glucose and extract electrons, which they transfer to energy storing molecules they called ATP. But they're also not just ATP, they're longer sugars, ketonic bodies, lipids, etc. So those electrons, they serve as the energy conduits in those molecules. And every time you break a molecule, you're going to release this energy in form of movement of electrons. So it's basically, you can think of it as microcurrents of electricity that serve to power biological entities. Just to note, plants also use respiration, but they only use it at night. So this energy is used to build many components of the biological system. So that includes complex sugars, lipids, and amino acids that we talked about, which are themselves used to build new proteins, which are put together in elaborate chain reactions that lead to what we call growth. So you're just building more materials and arranging them in a way that makes more cells, etc. So the other component, or the other function of growth, is the replacement of deteriorated components through recycling. It's basically waste disposal. And we have also programs that include or that induce what we call programmed cell death or apoptosis of damaged cells or aged cells. And as growth reaches a certain threshold, it's going to trigger another program, which is cell division. And you can see it in the bottom in the fluorescence microscopy. And that basically program, it's a complex program that's going to duplicate the cell components and the genetic material that you see here in teal. And that genetic material is the DNA that's contained the codes for all the proteins, and so it gets duplicated every time the cell divides. So the other function that is essential is protection and defense. So all organisms have a system to protect themselves from either the elements, so outer membranes, skins, barks, etc. You can see here an example of a cell membrane or the skin. Or they will have mechanisms to maintain either the physical variabilities, i.e. temperature, etc., within optimal range, or the chemical variables such as pH, etc., within normal range. In addition, almost all organisms will have predators or parasites that will seek to hijack their resources, and therefore they must defend themselves by using many tools, using either specialized antibiotics that kill specific bacteria, or antivirals like CRISPR, which is, you can see here the enzyme CRISPR that's cutting specifically viral DNA, or elaborate immune system or secreting poison, etc. In addition to that, we have what we call enabling function or facilitating functions. So starting with catalysis. So what is catalysis? So almost all chain reactions in biology, they need catalysis in order to be effective, in order for those chemical reactions to occur efficiently. Those catalyzing proteins, they're called enzymes. And each of those enzymes will be specialized in one reaction. And so we have many enzymes. Each one performs one function. And enzymes are activated by the presence of their reactants or through other proteins that will activate them. And activation always means a change of conformation of enzymes. You can think of it as a box that's closed, and then when you activate it, it becomes open or something like that. And when it becomes open, it becomes active and it does its function. And then it gets inactivated again, it closes again. So enzymes, actually, we didn't know for a long time how enzymes were able to accelerate those chemical reactions by a long shot. Until recently, we discovered that actually they use a property of quantum mechanics called quantum tunneling, whereby they accelerate the transfer of electrons and protons between their reactants because of the conformation that they have that brings them so close together to each other that they can facilitate the quantum tunneling that occurs. And so that's what explains their high efficiency. Among the other functions, the enabling functions, we have mobility. So apart from plants that don't move, all other organisms will need to move to find nutrients or to escape from dangers, etc. And so they will have different forms of mobility, like flagella for bacteria, as you see here, or wings and fins and limbs, etc. And then the other kind of facilitating functioning principle is the coordination of all of these functions. So the coordination of these functions, especially in complex organisms, including plants, they will have multiple mechanisms that vary in duration from, quick ones like electricity-based nervous systems that you see here in blue in those insects and worms, etc., to less quick coordination mechanisms using molecules called hormones that act basically in a chemical way, to even slower coordination using what we call gene silencing or non-silencing at the DNA level in what's called epigenetics. And you can see here specific proteins that go into specific genes and close them or open them. In addition to these facilitating functions, we have functions that are outsourced. And so no organism is going to make everything it needs. And for the sake of efficiency, it will actually specialize in parts of what they need and then outsource the remaining functions to other organisms. And thus, plants will outsource the extraction of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus from dead organisms to fungi, and they will outsource the extraction of those carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus from the soil to bacteria. And for example, herbivorous animals, they will outsource carbohydrate production to plants, so because they eat the plants. And then when they eat the plants, they eat the cellulose, but they cannot digest the cellulose because it's a highly long and stiff carbohydrate. So the breakdown of cellulose, they outsource it to the bacteria that live in their specialized stomach called the rumen, that's going to ferment the cellulose and break it down. Also, other animals and humans, they will outsource the production of essential amino acids and lipids to specialized bacteria that live in their intestine, and so on. And so the entire actually ecosystem is therefore interdependent. No entity can work alone. And so the specific components of an ecosystem will change with the available conditions and the geography in which they exist. So, an ecosystem in the mountains is different from that in the forest or the grasslands and deserts and oceans, etc. So now that we spoke about the general functions in biology, what are the functioning principles that biology operates under? So there are many principles. I just selected the ones that I think are the most important ones, and let's go through kind of a couple of them, and you will see parallels between biology functioning principles and maybe things that are used in engineering that they actually borrowed from nature. So the first is that form follows function. So what does that mean? So every shape in biology follows the function that it has to do, starting with the proteins. So their functions are determined by their shape, which allows them to form highly selective receptors, like you see here. For example, this is in yellow, or in skin color, this is a cell membrane, and the protein is in teal color, and it has a receptor that's going to be outside the cell that's going to bind specifically to this protein, just like a key in a keyhole. And once it binds, it's going to change the conformation, the 3D structure of the protein, and in the bottom it's going to make it active, and this change is going to enable it to transfer the signal or the information that it needs to transfer. So form follows function. This also applies to enzymes, which are specialized proteins that catalyze chemical reactions or cut other proteins, etc. Signaling proteins that transmit either activation or inhibition of signals at each process. Transportation structures like microtubules that are basically, they're just like their name says, they're microtubules that you can slide things on, just like a railroad track. Sliding structures like muscle proteins, where you have like proteins of actin and myosin sliding on top of each other, etc. So this principle carries actually across scales. So from the cellular level to the shape of the organelles in the cell, i.e. the mitochondria and the nucleus, etc., to the cells themselves in different tissues, to the organs themselves, to whole bodies. So this this form follows function principle is very broad in nature. The second principle is that functions work through pathways. And so each function has processes that are defined by triggers, and then a chain of transmission of signal from protein A to protein B to protein C, etc., until it gets to the action that it needs. And then it has feedback loops that will either stop the process when the desired action is done, or keep it going as long as it's needed. So these are called pathways, and these pathways are mediated by specialized proteins. So each protein will be assigned to a pathway. For example, insulin will bind to its specific receptors on cell membranes, which start a pathway that's going to activate the production of glucose receptors, which are also proteins that receive glucose. They will go inside in the cell membrane, and they will be able to catch the glucose and capture it. So all of this is a pathway. The other process is, the principle is that there is a balance between pathways that induce an action and pathways that inhibit an action. Especially for critical critical functions. So many of the critical functions, they will have a balance between inducers and inhibitors. And the resulting action is the one that's going to be prevailing amongst the two. So as an example, the program of programmed cell death that I talked about, which is called apoptosis, is managed by pathways that kill the cell, that are countered by pathways that enable cell survival. And when the cell is healthy, always the cell survival pathways will always prevail. But when the cell is no longer viable, there are triggers that will give more power to the inhibitors, and the balance will shift towards programmed cell death, and then they will execute the programmed cell death and kill the cell. This is also the case for cell division, for neurotransmission, for hormonal pathways, and many, many other processes. There's always a balance between inducers and inhibitors. The other principle is redundancy, and you've seen this in like principles of engineering design. So critical functions in biology have redundant pathways in case one becomes unavailable, either due to like environmental changes, there's no more oxygen, there's no more nutrients, etc., or in case they become overwhelmed because there's like too much ask on them, like someone who's doing like a very highly intense physical activity. So the oxygen the transportation of the oxygen in the blood is not enough to power the muscles, so they will have to have a redundant pathway to generate energy outside of oxygen. And so this is evident in energy generation, just like we mentioned, but also in the immunity, relying on both like cell-based defense systems, but also non-cell-based defense systems, such as protein-based complement system. And we're going to talk about this in physiology. And it gives the organisms the ability to continue their functions, but also to adapt to different conditions. So when conditions change and a pathway becomes inoperable, there's always another pathway that's going to take over. So redundancy is very important in biology. The other principle is signal amplification. So many pathways will have a long chain of activation, sometimes like 9 proteins or even more. So protein A activates protein B, which activates protein B, C, etc. And I always ask myself, like, why is it not that just like you have something that activates a protein activates an action, and we're done? Why do we have like 4, 5, 6, 7, 9 proteins? Well, the fact, the one thing that people don't pay attention to is that each step where one protein gets activated, in turn itself, it doesn't activate just one downstream protein, but it activates several. It activates 7, 8, 9, 100 proteins, and each one of those will activate many more, etc. So we have like basically an exponential response, and that amplification of the response is extremely important, because many of the events that start the actions are small events, that need larger responses in order to accomplish the action. So for example, if you have a detection of an infectious organism in the body, the infectious organism in the body is a very small signal, and then the entire body needs to react to a very small signal, so you need amplification. Or like a breach in a blood vessel and you have blood coming out, so you need to start the process to form a blood clot, but the blood clot has to be much larger than the breach itself, and so that you need amplification. So every time you need amplification of signal, the chain will be long and the activation will be exponential. And the last principle that I want to talk about is the coordinated communication. We touched upon it a little bit, but I think this is kind of a principle that also spans across, and it's something that if you specialize or you learn more about biology, you're going to see a lot of it. So in complex organisms, especially, cellular pathways have to be coordinated at higher levels, so between the cells, i.e. at the organ level, at the system level, at the organism level. And so to that end, they have many elaborate communication systems that exist either between the cells, like cell junctions that you see here in the images. You have like 3 types of cell junctions that you have here that enable cells to communicate with each other, and also at a higher level between cells and the nerves, which is the synapses, and also between functional organs through sending hormones between organs so that they can communicate, and also through the whole body through either hormones as well, but also the nervous system. And each of these modes are synchronized for a system to operate optimally. So none of these work independently. All of this work in concert. So it's kind of like a big symphony that enables the biological systems to work optimally and within nominal range. And with that, we came to the end of the principles of biology. I welcome your comments. Thank you for your attention, and we'll see you in the next video.